Hi everybody, welcome back to this week's Storytime for Grown-Ups here at the Blount County Public Library. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jana Federer and I work here at the library as the Public Events Coordinator, and I am very happy to be here with you today to read Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. I know that as a grown-up myself, I very much so still enjoy fairy tales, and I would be willing to bet that there are a couple other grown-ups out there who enjoy them as well. So I thought it would be really fun today to read a chapter of Peter Pan and share that with you all. We are going to read the chapter where Wendy and Michael and John are about to meet Peter Pan for real for the first time. We also get to meet Tinkerbell, who's one of my favorite characters. So this is chapter 3 of Peter Pan. Come away, come away. For a moment after Mr. and Mrs. Darling left the house, the nightlights by the beds of the three children continued to burn clearly. They were awfully nice little nightlights, and one cannot help wishing that they would have kept awake to see Peter. But Wendy's light blinked and gave such a yawn that the other two yawned also, and before they could close their mouths, all the three went out. There was another light in the room now, 1,000 times brighter than the night lights, and in the time we have taken to say this, it has been in all the drawers in the nursery, looking for Peter's shadow, rummaged the wardrobe, and turned every pocket inside out. It was not really a light. It made this light by flashing about so quickly, but when it came to rest for a second, you saw it was a fairy, no longer than your hand, but still growing. It was a girl called Tinkerbell, exquisitely gowned in a skeleton leaf, cut low and square, through which her figure could be seen to the best advantage. A moment after the fairy's entrance, the window was blown open by the breathing of the little stars, and Peter dropped in. He had carried Tinkerbell part of the way, and his hand was still messy with the fairy dust. "Tinkerbell," he called softly, after making sure that the children were asleep. "Tink, where are you?" She was in a jug for the moment, and liking it extremely. She had never been in a jug before. "Oh, do come out of that jug and tell me. How do you know where they put my shadow?" The loveliest tinkle as of golden bells answered him. "It is the fairy language. You ordinary children can never hear it, but if you were to hear it, you would know that you had heard it once before." Tink said that the shadow was in the big box. She meant the chest of drawers, and Peter jumped at the drawers, scattering their contents to the floor with both hands, as kings tossed halfpence to the crowd. In a moment he had recovered his shadow, and in his delight he forgot that he had shut Tinkerbell up in the drawer. If he thought at all, but I don't believe he ever thought, it was that he and his shadow, when brought near each other, would join like drops of water, and when they did not, he was appalled. He tried to stick it on with soap from the bathroom, but that also failed. A shudder passed through Peter, and he sat on the floor and cried. His sobs woke Wendy, and she sat up in bed. She was not alarmed to see a stranger crying on the nursery floor. She was only pleasantly interested. "Boy," she said courteously, "why are you crying?" Peter could be exceedingly polite also, having learned the grand manner at fairy ceremonies, and he rose and bowed to her beautifully. She was much pleased and bowed beautifully to him from the bed. "What's your name?" he asked. "Wendy Moira Angela Darling," she replied with some satisfaction. "What is your name?" "Peter Pan." She was already sure that he must be Peter, but it did seem a comparatively short name. "Is that all?" "Yes," he said rather sharply. He felt for the first time that it was the shortest name. "I'm so sorry," said Wendy Moira Angela. "It doesn't matter," Peter gulped. She asked where he lived. "Second to the right," said Peter, and then straight on till morning. What a funny address! Peter had a sinking. For the first time he felt that perhaps it was a funny address. "No, it isn't," he said. "I mean," Wendy said nicely, remembering that she was a hostess. "Is that what they put on the letters?" He wished he had not mentioned letters. "Don't get any letters," he said contemptuously. "But your mother gets letters?" "Don't have a mother," he said. Not only had he no mother, but he had not the slightest desire to have one. He thought them very overrated persons. Wendy, however, felt at once that she was in the presence of a tragedy. "Oh, Peter, no wonder you were crying," she said, and got out of bed and ran to him. "I wasn't crying about mothers," he said rather indignantly. "I was crying because I can't get my shadow to stick on. Besides, I wasn't crying." "It has come off?" "Yes." Then Wendy saw the shadow on the floor, looking so draggled, and she was frightfully sorry for Peter. "How awful," she said, but she could not help smiling when she saw that he had been trying to stick it on with soap. How exactly like a boy. Fortunately, she knew at once what to do. "It must be sewed on," she said, just a little patronizingly. "What's sewn?" he asked. "You're dreadfully ignorant." "No, I'm not." But she was exulting in his ignorance. "I shall sew it on for you, my little man," she said, though he was as tall as herself, and she got out her needle and sewed the shadow onto Peter's foot. "I dare say it will hurt a little," she warned him. "Oh, I shan't cry," said Peter, who was already of the opinion that he had never cried in his life, and he clenched his teeth and did not cry, and soon his shadow was behaving properly, though still a little creased. "Perhaps I should have ironed it," Wendy said thoughtfully, but Peter, boylike, was indifferent to appearances, and he was now jumping about in the wildest glee. Alas, he had already forgotten that he'd owed his bliss to Wendy. He thought he had attached the shadow himself. "How clever I am," he crowed rapturously. "Oh, the cleverness of me." It is humiliating to have to confess that this conceit of Peter was one of his most fascinating qualities. To put it with brutal frankness, there was never a cockier boy. But for the moment, Wendy was shocked. "You conceit," she exclaimed with frightful sarcasm. "Of course I did nothing." "You did a little," Peter said carelessly, and continued to dance. "A little," she replied. "If I am no use, I can at least withdraw." And she sprang in the most dignified way into bed and covered her face with the blankets. To induce her to look up, he pretended to be going away, and when this failed, he sat on the end of the bed and tapped her gently with his foot. "Wendy," he said, "don't withdraw. I can't help quarreling, Wendy, when I'm pleased with myself." Still, she would not look up, though she was listening eagerly. "Wendy," he continued, in a voice that no woman has ever yet been able to resist. "Wendy, one girl is more use than 20 boys." Now Wendy was every inch a woman, though there were not very many inches, and she peeped out of her bedclothes. "Do you really think so, Peter?" "Yes, I do. I think it's perfectly sweet of you," she declares, "and I'll get up again." She sat with him on the side of the bed. She also said that she would give him a kiss if he liked, but Peter did not know what she meant, and he held out his hand expectantly. "Surely you know what a kiss is," she said, aghast. "I shall know when you give it to me," he replied stiffly, and not to hurt his feelings, she gave him a thimble. "Now," said he, "shall I give you a kiss?" And she replied with a slight primness, "If you please." She made herself rather cheap by inclining her face toward him, but he merely dropped an acorn button into her hand, so she slowly returned her face to where it had been before, and said nicely that she would wear his kiss on the chain round her neck. It was lucky that she did put it on that chain, for it was afterwards to save her life. When people in our set are introduced, it is customary for them to ask each other's age, so Wendy, who always liked to do the correct thing, asked Peter how old he was. It was not really a happy question to ask him. It was like an examination paper that asked grammar, when what you want to be asked is kings of England. "I don't know," he replied uneasily, "but I am quite young." He really knew nothing about it. He had merely suspicions, but he said at a venture, "Wendy, I ran away the day I was born." Wendy was quite surprised, but interested, and she indicated in the charming drawing-room manner, by a touch of her nightgown, that he could sit nearer her. "It was because I heard father and mother," he explained in a low voice, "talking about what I was to be when I became a man." He was extraordinarily agitated now. "I don't want to ever be a man," he said with passion. "I want always to be a little boy and to have fun. So I ran away to Kensington Gardens and lived a long, long time among the fairies." She gave him a look of the most intense admiration, and he thought it was because he had run away, but it was really because he knew fairies. Wendy had lived such a home life that to know fairies struck her as quite delightful. She poured out questions about him, to his surprise, for they were rather a nuisance to him, getting in his way and so on, and indeed he sometimes had to give them a hiding. Still, he liked them on the whole, and he told her about the beginning of fairies. "You see, Wendy, when the first baby laughed for the first time, its laugh broke into 1,000 pieces, and they all went skipping about, and that was the beginning of fairies. Tedious talk this, but being a stay-at-home, she liked it. And so," he went on good-naturedly, "there ought to be one fairy for every boy and girl." "Ought to be? Isn't there?" "No. You see, children know such a lot now, they soon don't believe in fairies. And every time a child says, "I don't believe in fairies," there is a fairy somewhere that falls down dead. Really, he thought they had now talked enough about fairies, and it struck him that Tinker Bell was keeping very quiet. "I can't think where she has gone to," he said, rising, and he called Tink by name. Wendy's heart went flutter with a sudden thrill. "Peter," she cried, clutching him, "you don't mean to tell me that there is a fairy in this room?" "She was here just now," he said a little impatiently. "You don't hear her, do you?" And they both listened. "The only sound I hear," said Wendy, "is like a tinkle of bells." "Well, that's Tink. That's the fairy language. I think I hear her too." The sound came from the chest of drawers, and Peter made a merry face. No one could ever quite look so merry as Peter, and the loveliest of gurgles was his laugh. He had his first laugh still. "Wendy," he whispered gleefully, "I do believe I shut her up in the drawer." He let poor Tink out of the drawer, and she flew about the nursery screaming with fury. "You shouldn't say such things," Peter retorted. "Of course I'm very sorry, but how could I know you were in the drawer?" Wendy was not listening to him. "Oh, Peter," she cried, "if she would only stand still and let me see her." "They hardly ever stand still," he said, but for one moment Wendy saw the romantic figure come to rest on the cuckoo clock. "Oh, the lovely," she cried, though Tink's face was still distorted with passion. "Tink," Peter said amiably, "this lady says she wishes you were her fairy." Tinker Bell answered insolently. "What does she say, Peter?" He had to translate. "She is not very polite. She says you are a great ugly girl, and that she is my fairy." He tried to argue with Tink. "You know you can't be my fairy, Tink, because I am a gentleman and you are a lady." To this Tink replied in these words, "You silly," and disappeared into the bathroom. "She is quite a common fairy," Peter explained apologetically. "She is called Tinker Bell because she mends the pots and kettles." They were together in the armchair by this time, and Wendy plied him with more questions. "If you don't live in Kensington Gardens now—" "Sometimes I do still." "But where do you live mostly now?" "With the Lost Boys." "Well, who are they?" "They are the children who fall out of their perambulars when the nurse is looking the other way. If they are not claimed in 7 days, they are sent far away to the Neverland to defray expenses. I'm captain." "What fun it must be." "Yes," said cunning Peter, "but we are rather lonely. You see, we have no female companionship." "Are none of the other girls?" "Oh no, girls, you know, are much too clever to fall out of their prams." This flattered Wendy immensely. "I think," she said, "it is perfectly lovely the way you talk about girls. John there just despises us." For reply, Peter rose and kicked John out of bed, blankets and all, one kick. This seemed to Wendy rather forward for a first meeting, and she told him with spirit that he was not captain in her house. However, John continued to sleep so placidly on the floor that she allowed him to remain there. "And I know you meant to be kind," she said, relenting, "so you may give me a kiss." For the moment she had forgotten his ignorance about kisses. "I thought you would want it back," he said a little bitterly, and offered to return her thimble. "Oh dear," said the nice Wendy, "I don't mean a kiss, I mean a thimble." "What's this?" "It's like this." She kissed him. "Funny," said Peter gravely. "Now shall I give you a thimble?" "If you wish to," said Wendy, keeping her head erect this time. Peter thimbled her, and almost immediately she screeched. "What is it, Wendy?" It was exactly as if someone were pulling my hair. That must have been Tink. I never knew her so naughty before. And indeed Tink was turning about again, using offensive language. "She says she will do that to you, Wendy, every time I give you a thimble." "But why?" "Why, Tink?" And Tink replied, "You silly." Peter could not understand why, but Wendy understood, and she was just slightly disappointed when he admitted that he came to the nursery window, not to see her, but to listen to stories. "You see, I don't know any stories. None of the Lost Boys knows any stories." "How perfectly awful," Wendy said. "Do you know," Peter asked, "why swallows build in the eaves of houses? It is to listen to the stories. Oh, Wendy, your mother was telling you such a lovely story." "Which story was it?" "About the prince who couldn't find the lady who wore the glass slipper." "Peter," said Wendy excitedly, "that was Cinderella, and he found her, and they lived happily ever after." Peter was so glad that he rose from the floor where they had been sitting and hurried to the window. "Where are you going?" she cried with misgiving. "To tell the other boys." "Don't go, Peter. I know such lots of stories." Those were her precise words, so there can be no denying that it was she who first tempted him. He came back, and there was a greedy look in his eyes now which ought so have alarmed her, but did not. "Oh, the stories I could tell to the boys," she cried, and then Peter gripped her and began to draw her toward the window. "Let me go," she ordered him. "Wendy, do come with me and tell the other boys." Of course she was very pleased to be asked, but she said, "Oh dear, I can't. Think of Mummy. Besides, I can't fly. I'll teach you." "Oh, how lovely to fly. I'll teach you how to jump on the wind's back, and then away we go." "Ooh," she exclaimed rapturously. "Wendy, Wendy, when you are sleeping in your silly bed, you might be flying about with me saying funny things to the stars. And Wendy, there are mermaids." "Mermaids? With tails? Such long tails." "Oh," cried Wendy, "to see a mermaid." He had become frightfully cunning. "Wendy," he said, "how we should all respect you." She was wriggling her body in distress. It was quite as if she were trying to remain on the nursery floor, but he had no pity for her. "Wendy, you could tuck us in at night. None of us has ever been tucked in at night." "Ooh," she said, and her arms went out to him. "And you could darn our clothes and make pockets for us. None of us has any pockets." How could she resist? "Of course it's awfully fascinating," she cried. "Peter, would you teach John and Michael to fly too?" "If he would like," he said indifferently, and she ran to John and Michael and shook them. "Wake up," she cried. "Peter Pan has come, and he is to teach us how to fly." John rubbed his eyes. "Then I shall get up," he said. Of course he was on the floor already. "Hello, I am up." Michael was up by this time also, looking as sharp as a knife with 6 blades and a saw, but Peter suddenly signed silence. Their faces assumed the awful craftiness of children listening for sounds from the grown-up world. All was still as salt. Then everything was right. No, stop! Everything was wrong. Nana, who had been barking distressfully all the evening, was quiet now. It was her silence they heard. "Out with the light! Hide, quick!" cried John, taking command for the only time throughout the whole adventure, and thus when Liza entered, holding Nana, the nursery seemed quite its old self, very dark, and you could have sworn you heard its 3 wicked inmates breathing angelically as they slept. They were really doing it artfully from behind the window curtains. Liza was in a bad temper, for she was mixing the Christmas puddings in the kitchen and had been drawn away from them, with a raisin still on her cheek. But by Nana's absurd suspicions, she thought the best way of getting a little quiet was to take Nana to the nursery for a moment, but in custody, of course. "There, you suspicious brute," she said, not sorry that Nana was in disgrace. "They are perfectly safe, aren't they? Every one of the little angels sound asleep in bed. Listen to their gentle breathing." Here Michael, encouraged by his success, breathed so loud that they were nearly detected. Nana knew that kind of breathing, and she tried to drag herself out of Liza's clutches. But Liza was dense. "No more of it, Nana," she said sternly, pulling her out of that room. "I warn you, if you bark again, I shall go straight for Master and Mrs. and bring them home from the party. And then, oh, won't Master whip you just." She tied the unhappy dog up again, but do you think Nana ceased to bark? Bring Master and Mrs. home from the party. Why, that was just what she wanted. Do you think she cared whether she was whipped so long as her charges were safe? Unfortunately, Liza returned to her puddings, and Nana, seeing that no one would come for her, strained and strained at the chain until at last she broke it. In another moment she had burst into the dining room of 27 and flung up her paws to heaven, her most expressive way of making a communication. Mr. and Mrs. Darling knew at once that something terrible was happening in their nursery, and without a goodbye to their hostess, they rushed to the streets. We're going to stop there. So Mr. and Mrs. Darling just came home. What do you think they're going to see when they go up into the room? Do you think Wendy and John and Michael are still going to be there? Do you think they're going to be able to see Peter? If you know the story of Peter Pan, you can probably guess how it goes. But hopefully we can continue on with this story in the upcoming weeks. I want to thank you all for joining us again for this Storytime for Grown-Ups. We are back here at the library. We are not open to the public yet, but we do have many resources where you can get books like Peter Pan and others on Hoopla or on our Tennessee Reads app. If you're interested in any of those or our curbside pickup that we're doing for materials, you can give us a call at 982-0981, and we'll be happy to help our patrons in any way that we can. We miss you all. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you have a good rest of your week.